Call the honourable member John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join those other colleagues who've wished Roland a very happy birthday today, and let's hope he has a very happy Easter celebrating his advancing years. Mr. Speaker, I want to address the comments that have come here this afternoon into the House from the Green Party. These are the people that think that money grows on trees, and when it doesn't, they find a photocopier and they produce it, and they're going to give money into all directions of our community and try and buy the young person's vote. I say to you, Mr. Hughes, the young people in this country know that money does not grow on trees, and they will not be voting for the Green Party in large numbers because they've got far more sense. And apart from the Green Party growing money on trees, we've got the Labor member for Dunedin North, I think, the Red Reverend Mr. Clark, saying, yes, we've got to give more money to everybody, and this is a bad piece of legislation because it's not giving enough money to our students. Can I say this? Money doesn't grow on trees. Money comes out of people's pockets. It comes out of all of the pockets of those people who work in this country, including Roland. He pays his taxes. Money for these students comes from the workers' pockets. And you would say to the workers, here's some money, we'll take it out of your pocket and give it to the students. And by the way, students, you don't have to pay it back. What nonsense! What nonsense, miss? No, we did not do it. No, we did not do it. And we watched the students sitting on the roofs of their houses in Dunedin, burning their couches, and say, no, 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 we don't want to pay this money back. Well, I've got a lot of taxpayers in my electorate who advance money from their pockets to the government to advance to students. And there's no problem about lending money to students. We want to see them to do well. We want to see them to be educated. But we will not put up with the knowledge that these people don't need to repay their obligation to our society for using that money interest-free for a period of time while they complete their studies. I paid my loan back, and my children paid their loans back too, to the community. My family has met its obligations, unlike you. My family has met its obligations, which I suspect is more than is the case for you, madam.
Point of order, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, it is a sad thing when a member of the growing experience of the member who is currently speaking has drawn you into debate by speaking to you, sir, and he may have been referring to the very eloquent co-leader of the Green Party who was entering into the spirit of the discussion, I see, but sir, there's no excuse for drawing you into the debate, sir.
Well, thank you for that, and the Speaker has noted it. I call the Honourable Member John Hayes.
Mr. Speaker. He was the member yesterday in the Shane Jones committee who was sitting there wriggling with great excitement because every time Jones was getting shafted, he was benefiting from that, using the Audit Office to benefit from that inquiry. Mr. Speaker, let me come back to the bill.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Using the misrepresentation standing orders and speakers' rulings, I just clarify that I recused from the matter in which the member is alleging I was present.
No, that is a debatable issue, and there the matter ends. I call the Honourable Member John Hayes.
Speaker. This is a bit like that BBC programme, Repetition, I'm sick of it from that fellow on the other side of the House. He needs to sit and listen and learn and look after his colleague, Mr. Jones. Mr. Speaker, this bill is about repaying money borrowed from taxpayers, used by our children for education, and they need to learn that a core policy of this government, one of the priorities of this term, is building a more productive and competitive economy. Because it's only by lifting our economic performance that we can create jobs, boost incomes, improve living standards and provide world-class public services that our children and their families need. And that is why we are making this student loan scheme sustainable into the future by reducing the need for more government borrowing and preparing students for jobs for the future. Our interest-free student loan scheme is one of the most generous in the world, and we're going to keep it this way. Mr. Speaker, I support this bill totally.
I call the honourable member Tracy Martin.
Kia ora, Mr. Speaker.
Kia ora.
I rise to speak on the Student Loan Scheme Amendment Bill number 2. But before I begin on my pre-written comments, can I just comment how sad it is when, as some of our members begin to age, their minds begin to wander. Because the student loan scheme, let me just remind the House of a few facts. The student loan scheme was introduced in 1992. It is 21 years old. Mr. Hayes may no longer be aware of that fact. And Mr. Macleay surprises me also. I understand that Mr. Macleay has a youthful appearance and that some may think that he is still in his 20s, but I have it on very reliable information that he is somewhere in his 40s. So for Mr. Macleay to try and lay a guilt trip on the younger generation of today by saying that, and let us use Mr. Macleay's phrase, what was the phrase? They have the generosity of the taxpayer. They owe the generosity of the taxpayer. Mr. Macleay does still owe the generosity of the taxpayer, as does 120 other members of this House. But at the time that he went to university, I agree, Mr. Bennett, at least I recognise it and am grateful, Mr. Bennett, unlike the lack of memory Mr. Macleay apparently now reveals in the fact that when he gained his education, he didn't have to pay it back. Neither did you, Mr. Sabin, who is well into his 40s.
Order.
Neither did the good-looking Mr. Sabin, who is also well into his 40s. So I think let's put a bit of reality around this, shall we? None of the members who have spoken yet, apart from the young Mr. Hughes, have actually had to take out a loan for their education. They have had an obligation to this country. I do beg your pardon, madam. There are obviously younger members of this House behind me that I neglected to mention. But many of the speakers currently from the government benches, they got a free education. The speakers to date got a free education. So for them to lay a guilt trip on the young people of today, I think that's exceptionally disappointing. I think the other thing too, Mr. Macleay also mentioned with regard to this bill was, he mentioned this phrase, the overwhelming support of this government. And all I can say is that if this is the overwhelming of support of a national-led government, then Lord help us as we go forward. Because while we're all going to be away watching Easter bunnies and eating chocolate Easter eggs, on the 1st of April, the student loan repayment rate will increase from 10% to 12%. That's a 2% increase out of the pay packets of already struggling people whose income has not risen, but the cost of living has risen. And the cost of living has risen. So let's bring a little bit of reality back into this, shall we? And for Mr. Hayes, who at the committee stage of this bill had the audacity to attempt to manufacture a greater divide between the younger generation and our older generation by suggesting that student loans were required because of the introduction of the gold card, separated by at least 10 years in introduction, with student loans being introduced in 92 and the gold card being introduced in 2008, I worry. I truly, truly worry for that member and his ability to retain information for long periods of time. I was particularly interested in Mr. Macleay. Again, let's come back to the overwhelming support of this government for our young people. Where was the overwhelming support of this government for fairness when I had a supplementary order paper on the table at committee stage that would have brought some fairness into this bill for New Zealand-based borrowers? to allow them to be recognised that in hard financial times, and the government does not reject the fact that we are in difficult financial times, they use it often to justify many of their actions. Where was their overwhelming support for New Zealand-based borrowers when I had a supplementary order paper on the table that would have allowed them to provide some of that overwhelming support for New Zealand-based borrowers in recognition of a one-year repayment holiday due to financial duress? Where was that support? It was not to be seen. Somehow, oh, that's lovely. So that overwhelming support was not obvious at that time, and I would hope that possibly in the future, the next time this bill comes into the House, because I do not believe this government has finished with the student loan scheme, that there might be an opportunity for that to be supported further. But as a previous credit controller, I do support the concept of people paying back their debt. I have worked with people over my professional life and I know the subconscious burden that debt places on an individual. So the faster debt can be addressed, if debt must be incurred, then the better it is for the individual out the other side. So New Zealand First did support originally in the previous amendment bill the shortening of the repayment holiday for overseas-based borrowers. But we also recognise that we are providing an overwhelming debt burden for our young people with this mechanism of borrowing for education. And there needs to be a wider return to the concept of the social contract, where you gain from your state supports you to educate yourself, and then you give back to your country through your skills and your time. I beg your pardon, sir. I met a young gentleman the other day who is embarking on a short course around coding. Now, I don't personally know much about coding, but what I do know about coding is that there is a worldwide shortage in young people expanding that knowledge base, particularly in this country, around the writing of code for programs. Now, in this conversation with this young 18-year-old, he expressed to me how he was thinking about not following his passion, not pursuing that educational pathway, because he was looking at approximately $10,000 to $20,000 worth of debt at the end of it. I hope that I convinced that young man to continue on that pathway, because it's country, and we've just seen the ICT awards, we've just seen 5 of our game manufacturing companies in the top 10 internationally win awards. I hope that I convinced that young man that even though right now he works under a regime where his state decides that he must borrow to live and he must borrow to actually educate himself, that he will continue to pursue it, sir. But it is a shame that we have to have those conversations. And I think that's what has been tried to be expressed by New Zealand First again and again and again over the years since 1992, since this was introduced. We are putting young people off further education, and it is not this high-end tertiary education only that is affected. StudyLink. Every single student that goes on to StudyLink is looking at a student loan and borrowing to live for their living allowances, which gets tacked on at the end of it. They come out in their 20s. We all know, we all had the opportunity to come out in our 20s, go to work, start saving money and trying to get into a home. These young people carry this debt like a millstone around their necks. New Zealand First will support this bill because, let's be frank, it does 2 little things, nothing major, not earth-shattering, but it does bring it in line with some other relatively practical mechanisms inside the Inland Revenue and around information matching with customs. So, sir, of course we're not going to oppose these little practical steps, but an opportunity was lost, and the continual insistence of members of the government to try and shame our young people into being grateful for something that they got for nothing, I think it's disgraceful, sir.
I call the honourable member